Welcome back, History 1302, to another lecture, and today the topic that we'll be covering is that of the Great Depression. Now, when we were in class last time, we began our discussion over the 1920s. We talked about how American society, while it had witnessed a short recession after the end of World War I, it would enter its longest period of sustained prosperity that we'd see throughout American history. The American economy was growing and it was booming, and it contributed to why we would see a society of pleasure. However, while pleasure characterized the 1920s, we'll see that the decade of the 1930s would be the exact opposite. As all this prosperity was booming by the end of the 20s, we'll see that it would come crashing down by 1929, and the 1930s will be characterized by suffering. Now, with that said, this brings us to our topic today, that of the Great Depression. Now, the question is, what will bring about an end to that prosperity in the 1920s? Well, for most financial panics as well as depressions that we see throughout world history, there's usually not one singular issue that will cause the depression. And so there are quite literally hundreds of reasons to why we could have seen this depression begin, but we're just going to narrow it down to a few key issues. Now, by the end of the 1920s, we do see that even though America's economy was prospering, we do start to see it begin to slow down and enter a recession by the time we get to 1927 and 1928. The biggest issue that we see confronting the U.S. economy by that point is as it became increasingly reliant on a consumer-based society, we do start to see that Ford's Motor Company, as well as various other industries, were beginning to overproduce their products as there was not enough consumption taking place. Now, by the end of the 1920s, when we take a look at what, for just a second, Ford's Motor Company, we start to see that his company was producing too many cars, and there was not enough demand for the cars that he was beginning to pump out. As a result, we do start to see that there will be layoffs within varieties of industries by the 1927 and 1928, and that will only continue into 1929. But as the nation was entering a short recession, many Americans did not think it was that alarming. However, this would all change by the time we get to the end of the year 1929, when we'll see widespread not only business closures, but also bank closures, and we'll see the entire U.S. stock market will collapse. Now, for many who, when they think of the start of the Great Depression, they often think of the stock market crashing in October of 1929. Now, while this is going to be a major factor to why we'll see the Depression become so bad over time, I do want to point out the economy, as I mentioned a moment ago, it was beginning to enter a recession. However, the stock market, when it crashes, while it will not cause the Depression, it will rapidly accelerate it. Now, when the stock market crashes in October of 1929, it would worsen the Depression as we started to see it develop by the end of the 1920s. Now, how is it going to do this? Well, what we will see is as stock prices begin to plummet, as we see investors lose over $15 billion virtually overnight, we'll see many banks who had heavily invested within the stock market are also going to begin to lose their money. On top of that, we'll also see that investors who had put their money into banks are going to begin to withdraw them because they feared that there could be a widespread collapse of the banks. And as we started to see runs on the banks to where Americans tried to take out their entire life savings before the bank closed, this is what's going to make the Depression so bad. And that's why the stock market would be so crucial in it. We start to see that there was a loss of investor confidence. And as a result, by the beginning of 1930, after $45 billion had been lost on the stock market, we'd see roughly about 1,000 banks would begin to shut their doors because they simply did not have the money to pay back their investors. As a result, when you start to see banks begin to shut down, this leads to a domino effect for the rest of the U.S. economy. We'll start to see that they wouldn't be able to issue out loans so businesses could continue to function. And you'd start to see businesses shut their doors, and then from there you would start to see employees begin to be laid off. And that's how the stock market crashing is going to accelerate the Depression. Now, by 1930, after about a year of seeing stock prices plummet, we will see that America effectively will enter not only a new decade, but a new period as suffering would be the order of the day. And the Depression began to get worse as we go throughout the 1930s. Now, by 1930, 1931, what we'll see is the full effects of the Depression would be in place. A variety of businesses and various industries would begin to close their doors as they weren't turning profits. They'd begin to lay off workers, and the few workers that they are able to keep in their factories, if they're able to remain open, they're going to have to significantly cut their wages. And as a result, by the time we get to 1932, because of everything that has happened over the previous few years, we'll see that about a quarter of Americans are going to be unemployed as a result of the Depression. Not to mention, we'll see that, as I mentioned a moment ago, a number of them are going to have their wages significantly cut. And this is also going to further worsen conditions. And as you do start to see Americans begin to become unemployed, for those who were struggling to survive, they would go out daily, standing at bread lines, trying to get some sort of work, maybe working on a one-day contract for a company and so forth. But we'd also see that about 500,000 Americans without a job, without any sort of income, would begin to lose their homes, and they would become homeless. And as a result, what they're going to then do is begin to construct communities that they would ultimately dub Hoovervilles to try to survive in. Now, these Hoovervilles that will be constructed, they're basically going to be a slap at the current president who's in office, out of Herbert Hoover, who will talk more about his response to the Depression a little bit later on. But conditions within these Hoovervilles would be appalling. These would basically be these 10 shacks that would be constructed in the middle of American cities, and they would be no larger than probably one of the classrooms that maybe you've taken at your college. But with that said, you would have 10 plus people that were packed into these small little shacks trying to survive and live through the Depression. On top of that, conditions within the Hoovervilles would witness malnutrition, a rise in illness, and more notably a rise in crime, because especially as Americans begin to get desperate because of the conditions of the Depression, they would turn to crime to try to support their families. Now, as we do see a number of Americans begin to become unemployed, and they do start to begin to steal food and so on and so forth, we will see that some Americans will try to gain money through other reasons, as they couldn't get employment through a factory. We'll actually see that outside of many of these Hoovervilles, especially in New York City, you would see a number of stands selling local products, particularly local crops. And one of the popular slogans at the time was buy an apple a day, eat the Depression away. And it gives us a good insight on how the U.S. economy needed to get going again. These Americans who are beginning to withdraw their money from banks, who are losing their jobs, in order for them to support the economy, they needed to invest in it again. However, we will see that it would be up to the federal government to try to renew this interest in investing in the economy. And as the Depression gets worse, we'll see that by 1930 and then up to 1932, Americans are going to look to the president for leadership. However, Hoover's response to the Depression is going to be anything but great. It's going to be lackluster. Now, President Herbert Hoover, he would be elected to the presidency during the election of 1928 and take over in March of 1929. Now, he would win in a landslide victory, and basically Americans, when they voted him into office, was to continue this economic prosperity. However, within 6 months of taking the oath of office, we see that the U.S. economy had come crashing down. Now, to be fair towards Hoover, this was not his fault. This had been established because of policies in previous administrations, as well as other issues that we see associated during the 1920s. However, nonetheless, his response to the Depression is going to be anything but great. We'll see that many Americans will begin to lose faith in Herbert Hoover, and they would no longer view him as a Superman who could resolve any crisis he wanted to when they had elected him in 1928. Now, Hoover, what was his initial response when we do start to see the Depression really begin to develop by 1930 and 1931? Well, a couple of things that he's going to do is first go on a slogan campaign to try to get Americans to once again invest in the economy. That's not going to work. But to summarize his slogan campaign, basically what he's going to say is let the economy fix itself, not wanting any sort of government intervention. And we'll see that conservatives that were in Congress at this time, as well as impacting his administration, this is what their policy would be in 1930. However, as we see the Depression get worse, this is when you'll start to see more progressives begin to rise to power to demand action during this period. And as a result of public pressure, we'll see that by 1931 and 1932, Hoover would have to respond with something else to provide some sort of government aid. He couldn't stand by the side and try to let the economy fix itself. And as a result, we'll see that he would push forth a number of programs in 1932 to resolve the economic crisis, the most famous of which being that of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, just basically in a nutshell, is going to be an effort by Herbert Hoover to revive banks that we see across the nation, as well as various businesses in a variety of industries. What he's basically going to do is raise over $50 million within Congress to put into either banks or into these businesses. Now, while over time the Reconstruction Finance Corporation would be crucial to the success of ensuring that American banks wouldn't continue to fail, we'll see that many Americans are going to be very critical of the RFC whenever it's first published. If the government can issue out $500 million And eventually, more than that, why couldn't they pump this money into the economy? Why couldn't they give it to average Americans in the form of some sort of aid? And so this would make Hoover somewhat unpopular by the time we get to 1932, if he wasn't so already with the outbreak of the Depression. Other things that he would implement around this time is we'll see that even before this, he would implement a tariff which would worsen the economy. And lastly, he would implement perhaps the worst timed Revenue Act in American history, to where he would raise taxes in the midst of a depression. Now, these taxes that will be collected will be crucial for the New Deal programs we'll talk about a little bit later on, but nonetheless, this isn't going to make him popular. On top of that, as we get to the summer of 1932, as we are preparing for our presidential election, to where Hoover was hoping to regain the White House, we're going to see that he's going to become extremely unpopular and unelectable when we see what occurs with the bonus army. Now, all Americans in some way, in some fashion, are going to be impacted by the Depression. And one group of Americans that would heavily be impacted by the Depression would be that of America's veterans from the First World War. Now, American veterans from World War I are going to march on the Capitol in the summer of 1932. Now, the reason for this is because in 1924, there had been passed an act by Congress that would guarantee them, by 1945, because of their service during the First World War to helping an American victory, they would be granted a bonus. Now, with that said, most veterans knew that this bonus was waiting for them. However, as the Depression was getting worsened, as we see large numbers of unemployed within the ranks of the America's veterans, they will want to try to cash in on that check a little bit early. They would march in the summer of 1932 to try to get their bonus checks. However, when they march on the Capitol, we'll see that President Hoover, convinced that the bonus army, roughly about 10,000 American veterans, convinced that they were being led by a group of communists trying to overthrow the federal government, he would send in the U.S. military, about 2,000 troops, to break up the bonus army. Commanding the troops that would break up the bonus army would be that of Douglas MacArthur, who would rise to fame not only during World War I, but also during World War II. Also with him would be figures like Dwight Eisenhower, as well as George S. Patton, who would be present there, also of fame during the Second World War. Now, they will effectively crush the bonus army. However, when the bonus army disperse and word of this arrives across the nation, imagine today if American veterans were targeted by the federal government. Well, this would be wildly unpopular. This is exactly what's going to be the case in 1932. In the case of Hoover's rival in the upcoming election, the Democratic nominee Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he would remark in this episode that this basically elects me. And that's quite literally true, because with all these policies that we've talked about so far, plus the bonus army episode, it makes Hoover unelectable in 1932. Now, in the summer of 1932, when we see the bonus army broken up, we'll see that Hoover was hoping to win re-election. However, that event effectively ends his campaign, if you will, for the presidency. While he'll run as a Republican nominee, it basically ensures that he won't be elected. Running on the other side of the aisle would be the Democratic nominee, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, FDR, he was a progressive, very similar to his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, who had been in office not even just a few decades earlier. But with that said, the campaign that Roosevelt's going to run is he's going to be promoting to the American people that he has new ideas. He has a new deal that he would offer to the American people, to where he would bring about government aid and government intervention to try to resolve the Depression. Now, he's not going to reveal any of his New Deal programs or any of his thoughts, because if he were to do so, Americans might think it strikingly similar to socialism. And by this point, America had a very complicated history with socialism, and it was increasingly unpopular, especially after the rise of communism in the Soviet Union. Now, I do want to point out there's a difference between communism and socialism, but Americans at the time aren't going to differentiate the two. But anyways, nonetheless, because of what happened with the bonus army and because of the fact that Roosevelt was providing something different in regards to Herbert Hoover, he would easily win the election in 1932, winning a landslide victory. Now, when Roosevelt takes the presidential office in March of 1933, he would deliver his famous speech that the only thing Americans have to fear is fear itself. And the reason he was stating things like this is because he understood the programs he was about to implement. And the first 100 days of his administration would prove to be crucial in pushing forth his New Deal programs. And this is where we get that standard set to where American presidents and presidential nominees today state that the first 100 days are the most crucial days of their presidency. Because for FDR, the first 100 days were crucial in implementing the New Deal programs to bring about genuine aid to hopefully lift the U.S. out of the Great Depression. Early on in Roosevelt's administration, when he begins to implement the New Deal programs, he'll first focus on the banking crisis that we had seen really make this depression significantly worse, and then also we'll see he'll start to target other areas like the American industry, as well as the agricultural sector, and so on and so forth. Now, we're not going to talk about all of his programs, and I'll leave that up to y'all as you'll read through the chapter for this week. But anyways, each one of the programs that he establishes, regardless of what industry it was looking to address, it's going to be based around three things. These policies will either be established to bring about relief to the American people, it would either be established to help recover the American economy, and lastly, to reform that respective industry to ensure that something like what we have just seen would never happen again. Now, with that said, as mentioned before, one of the first things he's going to do is target the banking sector. He'd actually target it through the banking relief programs that he'd issue throughout the first couple of weeks of his administration. On top of that, we'd also see that he would look to address the industrial sector to revive it from the grips of the Depression to provide American workers with some semblance of work. And one of the most noteworthy programs that we'll see established early on in his New Deal in that first 100 days would be the establishment of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And by looking at this agency, we can see what kind of programs Roosevelt was trying to create to bring America out of this depression. Now, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or as I'll refer to it, the CCC, when it's established, it's meant to bring about relief to the American people. Now, in regards to the Civilian Conservation Corps, and really in general to the New Deal programs, what Roosevelt isn't trying to do is issue out money directly to the American people. What he's trying to do is provide jobs to where Americans can either gain experience, but more notably gain an income that they could use to then invest into the American economy. And this was the whole purpose of organizations like the Civilian Conservation Corps, and as I'll talk about more here in a moment, the Works Progress Administration. Get America back to work, get an income to Americans to where they would then be more willing to purchase consumer goods and get the economy rolling again. Now, the Civilian Conservation Corps, it's largely going to target American males between the ages of 18 to 24. Now, basically, as a part of the Conservation Corps, it's meant to be a temporary program. These individuals that would go off to serve within the Civilian Conservation Corps, they would serve typically from usually about 9 months during the course of their contract and make about $1 a day. Now, that doesn't sound a whole lot. However, this was significant because the hope was that through this program, as they were working, they would send their income back to their families at home as they were building many of the projects that they would construct. Now, what would the Civilian Conservation Corps be doing? As well as many of these organizations, they're not going to be doing jobs that are what we would consider, say, necessary or mandatory. But rather what we'll see the CCC construct are things like ditches, roads, and national parks, and so on and so forth. Now, once again, those aren't necessary jobs. However, it was crucial because it gives them something to do, it gives them experience, and more importantly, it gives them an income. And the federal government would do this. Now, with that said, as I mentioned a moment ago, this was not meant to be a permanent organization. We'll see it eventually will expire by 1942. But nonetheless, it would provide a lot of work for young American men. Now, I do want to point out one thing with the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. As we'll see with many other agencies, especially during the first New Deal, many of them are going to be racially segregated. We'll see that really the only individuals who could be involved in the CCC early on are going to be white American males. African Americans, the impact of the Depression on them is going to be tremendous. One, we'll see they'll be segregated out of these groups. And also, remember how I said there was about a quarter of Americans who would be unemployed? Well, the Depression would be even worse amongst African Americans. We'll see about 50% of African Americans will be unemployed at any point during the course of this Depression. And we'll see that while many of these programs will be while many of these programs will help uplift many other Americans, we'll see that the African American community will be racially segregated out of them. However, through a common experience with the Depression, especially amongst the homeless, between white Americans and African Americans, we will see it will kind of promote a sense of racial solidarity. But that won't change a whole lot racial politics during this period, so I just wanted to point that out. But anyways, the Civilian Conservation Corps, it was just one of many different agencies that we'd see established during what's called the first New Deal, those programs established in Roosevelt's first 100 days. And the importance of these programs is they will begin to bring some semblance of relief, recovery, or reform to American society during this period. And it's also what's going to be crucial is it's going to install hope into Americans that they can overcome this hump and get out of the Depression. However, not all Americans are going to support the New Deal programs that he was pushing forth. Many are going to argue that they are strikingly close to getting to socialism, especially when you see agencies like the NRA or the National Recovery Administration try to set wages as well as dictate policies to what companies can and can't do. And as a result, so no surprise, by 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court, largely a conservative Supreme Court, is going to begin to strike down many of these agencies. However, as his New Deal was coming under attack, in 1935, Roosevelt once again is going to issue a renewed series of legislation to recreate his New Deal, but it would prove to be a little bit more radical to bring about those 3 R's that I mentioned a moment ago. Now, his second New Deal programs will mainly be passed from 1935 to 1936. And we'll see that he would put more money into the U.S. economy, and he would establish new agencies that individuals called even more radical than what we had seen in the first New Deal. He would establish things like Social Security to bring about aid for especially America's elderly. He would also establish the Wagner Act to give more authority and power to labor unions, so that way we could see collective bargaining as well as see higher worker wages during this period. And another agency he would establish, which would become widely popular, and probably many of us are very familiar with if we don't know it, would be that of the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. Now, the WPA, what we'd see is the federal government is going to spend about $4.9 billion to put into this program, and it's going to have a variety of different tasks. One, we'll see it would help try to put back to work American construction workers as well as other industries. But we'd also see through the WPA is it would look to put to work things like historians, photographers, artists for the federal government. In regards to historians, we'd see that they would begin to collect data, especially in regards to a dying off generation of slaves, to try to keep their voices as a result of their generation beginning to slowly die off. We see with photographers, they would begin to photograph and record the Depression, and artists would produce artwork for the federal government that we put into government buildings. These weren't necessary jobs, but it gives them a job to get income to then invest into the economy. Now, I had mentioned a moment ago that the Works Progress Administration, many of us are probably familiar with their work, even if we don't know it. Now, here in Houston, you can find a project of the Works Progress Administration that does have a lot of local history. For those of you that have gone out to the San Jacinto Battleground, if you look at the memorial or the San Jacinto Monument, as well as the reflection pool, that was constructed by the WPA. Also, if you've been to San Antonio, the Riverwalk, it was constructed by the WPA, as well as a variety of other things that we see during this period. And just like the Civilian Conservation Corps, this was meant to bring income to Americans during the midst of the Depression. And it would be wildly successful, and Americans would look very fondly on some of these organizations as was bringing some sort of relief. However, even though we do see the passage of these new administrations during the Second New Deal, they would continue to come under attack by both conservative as well as progressive politicians. And we continue to see the U.S. Supreme Court would strike down many of these programs. And when Roosevelt wins re-election in 1936, he's going to unveil the most ambitious and radical of his Second New Deal policies when he tries to pack the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, by 1937, what we'll see is to ensure that his New Deal policies would survive, Roosevelt's going to speak directly to the American people in what would become his fireside chats, calling on them to support his policy of court packing, to where he would raise the number of Supreme Court judges from 9 to 14 or even 15. The reason for this is he wants to put more progressive judges on the bench so they can stop declaring his agencies unconstitutional. However, for most Americans, while they may have supported many of the programs so far, this is where they're going to draw a line in the sand. This will be widely unpopular, and we'll see that Roosevelt would not gain any sort of support to push forth his court packing initiative. But nonetheless, we'd still continue to see that his New Deal programs would be wildly successful. And on top of that, we do start to see that the U.S. economy by 1936 and 37 was slowly recovering, easing out of the Depression. But this is where Roosevelt's going to contribute to the downfall of the success of his programs. Believing that the U.S. economy no longer needed this government intervention, we will see that he would begin to withdraw funding from many of his programs. However, as a result of doing this, this is actually going to send the U.S. economy back into the Depression. In 1937, what's been dubbed Roosevelt's recession, we'll see that stock prices would plummet just like they had done at the beginning of the 1930s. We'd see widespread bank closures, and America would remain in the Depression. Now, with that said, as he does put money back into these programs, the effects of what he had just done would continue to linger on for the next several years. And America, even with the best efforts of Roosevelt through his New Deal programs, will not get out of the Depression. It will take American mobilization during World War II for America to come out of the Depression. And so while the New Deal is a complete failure because it doesn't bring out the U.S. out of this depression, I do want to end on this point. While it was failing in that aspect, we will see that it's going to be successful in another. While we get to the end of the 1930s, while many Americans were still suffering, they had hope, believing that the next decade, or at least in the near future, that the nation could survive and live on. And it guaranteed that American democracy would also survive. Now, why is that crucial? Well, it's because as we see these programs renew hope, when we look over to Europe, and we start to see what's occurring over in Germany as well as Italy because of economic downturns, it's no surprise to why we'll see Americans would support democracy, whereas other nations, when their governments fail to do anything, they start to appeal to political radicalism. But we'll talk about the rise of Adolf Hitler as well as Benito Mussolini in our next lecture. But anyways, we'll go ahead and we'll end on that note, just like always, as I wrap up this lecture. Make sure you go out, complete all outstanding assignments, read all the required readings, read the textbook chapter and all of that good stuff. But anyways, if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me. But otherwise, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see everybody in the next video.